I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that the territory the Wilson Institute for Canadian History currently sits on is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. And though we're all meeting here tonight in a virtual setting, I'd like to invite you all to reflect on the territories you reside on and on how you can help fight racism and inequality in your everyday lives. Tonight's event is a great event. We're celebrating the publication of a new book with the Wilson series at McGill-Queens Press. And now without further ado, I'll let our gracious host, Sean Mills, take over. Sean?
Yes, thank you so much for the message, Max. So my name is Sean Mills. I'm a professor of history at the University of Toronto. It's my absolute delight to celebrate and engage with this book this evening. So I just want to let everyone know a little bit about how we're going to proceed today. I'm going to begin by introducing the editor of the book in question and the author of many of the components of the book in question, Jordan Stanger-Ross. He's going to speak to us for about 10 or 15 minutes. Following this, I'm going to introduce each panelist. And we have 4 panelists who are going to speak very briefly for about 5 minutes to the book. Following this, we'll allow one kind of moment of exchange where we'll ask Jordan to respond to the responses of the panelists, and if anyone on the panel has any further follow-up question at that point, we'll open it up to that. Following this, we'll open it up to a broader discussion with all of you. I will ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the event. And if you'd like to speak, I'll be beginning a speakers list, and you could just simply write your name in the chat, and then I'll call upon you and you could unmute yourself and then ask your question. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jordan Stanger-Ross, who is a University of Victoria's Provost Engaged Scholar. He's also Associate Professor of History and Project Director of the Landscape of Injustice Project, a 4-year Shirk Partnership project from 2014 to 2021, which is a project to tell the history of dispossession of Japanese Canadians. His work on this topic has received honors from the Canadian Historical Association, the Society of Regional and Planning History, and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. His previous book, Witness to Loss, co-edited with Pamela Sugerman, was shortlisted for the Wilson Institute Prize for the Best Book in Canadian history. His work has been extremely influential across a number of fields. I know it's constantly taught by me here at the University of Toronto at the undergrad level and in graduate courses. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Sean and Max. This is a lot of fun for me. This is, aside from actually meeting critics, virtually meeting critics is about the first way I would choose to spend my time. It's really exciting to have a number of respondents to the book who I greatly admire, and to have the chance to hear how the impression that the book made on them and to respond to it. I think it's a wonderful generosity of all the panelists to participate in that way. So thank you so much. And I'm glad to be part of the Wilson Institute as an affiliate, and to be able to present the work in connection with the Institute as well. So I want to get straight to the critical responses to the book. For sure, I'll offer a little bit of introduction, first to the project, and then to some of the central claims of the book. And then I'll point a little bit to the significance that I hope it has. And I was thinking of introducing the project and the book together by way of my initial resistance to ever producing this book in the first place. There was debate internal to the Landscapes of Injustice Research Project about whether this book should exist. And I was on the negative side. And so I think I can convey a little bit of the project through that discussion to you. So Landscapes of Injustice was founded in 2014 as a large partnership project with 17 partnering institutions and some 60 participants at any given moment in time, coming from a variety of different academic fields, geographers, legal scholars, and historians, especially prominent within the research collective, but also including folks from other sectors who were there from the outset of the project with us as we did this work and helping to set the direction of the project, both through a community council, some members of whom I see are here today, and through the participation of teachers at elementary and secondary school levels, museum professionals, librarians, archivists, who from the outset of the project knew that they would be mobilizing our research into their own sectors. All of our research was focused on this facet of the internment policies in Canada, whereby the federal government decided in 1943, after neglecting property that had been entrusted to them for almost a year, decided to force the sale of all the property that Japanese Canadians had been forced to leave behind, including homes, businesses, farms, personal possessions, really anything that Japanese Canadians hadn't been able to take with them. Our project started from the premise that that was a major policy decision, and that for Japanese Canadians that had a major impact on their experiences of the internment years, but also the decades that followed. And so our project emerged from that basic claim. In 2018, we were shifting gears as a project. We had finished research, we had conducted oral histories, we had conducted title searches, we had done legal historical research, we had done archival research, and we had generated some 30 publications in different specialized academic journals, as well as in public venues, and 2 books, one a community-based non-academic book and one an academic book, which Sean mentioned. And in 2018, the project was poised to pivot to knowledge mobilization. So now the leadership of key areas of activity would be assumed by teachers and museum professionals and librarians and people who would tell stories online. And they would hire the research assistants and undertake the work for the remaining 3 years of the project. And that had been its design. And at that moment of pivot in the project, a controversy emerged about whether a single summative research statement should be made that would guide that knowledge mobilization, or whether in fact a project of our kind created research knowledge through a wide range of diverse publications in diverse fields. And it was my position, at least initially, that the context, aims, and significance of telling this history in a 5th grade classroom, say, would never converge with those of telling that history in a legal journal or the telling of it by a property theorist. And similarly, museums would have their own context theories and aims in telling the history. And I questioned what the value was of a single summative integrated statement. That argument, which I even find somewhat convincing as I articulate it now, did not convince very many of my colleagues on the project, and particularly the advisory board urged us to take the position that a single integrated research statement was required by those folks who would mobilize the knowledge, that it was the role of the academic leads or lead on the project to provide a single coherent statement of research that could be mobilized through those other sectors. And I'm very thankful that I lost that argument. The writing of the book was the most fulfilling and exciting intellectual work of my career. I got to work with some wonderful co-authors and got to spend the time to try and integrate all of those diverse contributions. And we did find that museum professionals, teachers, and others who work with us appreciated that unified, integrated voice, analytic voice. But I think it's still an interesting question. What is the nature of the contribution that these large, multifaceted projects seek to undertake? And what is the role within that contribution to knowledge that a single integrated volume is meant to make? And this book is maybe a bit of a compromise in that it's multi-authored, and yet it does seek to present a single integrated argument. That argument centers around 4 claims, one of which I've already identified, and the 4 claims each constitute a part of the book, which then have multiple authors contributing to each part. So that first claim is that the era involved a deliberate killing of home, and that we should understand the internment of Japanese Canadians as having involved this destruction of the homes and communities that Japanese Canadians had built, rather than thinking it only or primarily through the perspective of a temporary internment. The second is that that process of destroying homes required sustained work. It struck me as I thought about the contribution of our research that the internment had often been thought of as a momentary decision to uproot and intern all Japanese Canadians or not. And in thinking about that moment of decision, scholars had sometimes said that racism had shaped that decision. Other scholars had argued that the moment of war had influenced that decision. And those same positions were articulated in public discussion of the era. And that may be an important discussion, but I thought our work showed years of sustained work by the administrative state in the lives of Japanese Canadians that went far beyond any moment of panic or indeed any momentary decision. The third part of the book engages the rationalizations or ideas that were brought to bear to execute by workers within the state to execute and justify those decisions, and the challenges that Japanese Canadians brought against those ideas, including in court. And it was never sufficient for the state to say Japanese people are an unassimilable race and therefore will dispossess them of their property. Instead, they had ways of rationalizing and legalizing this action, and it was those rationalizations that Japanese Canadians had to respond to when they sought to push back against the policy. The fourth part of the book deals with the permanence of dispossession, that some things once broken can't be put back together again. This era has had ramifications, has left legacies in both material benefit and harm in the memories of Japanese Canadians and others, and the politics of redress and the politics that have followed after redress. So those claims structure the book and are the core arguments articulated in a somewhat lengthy introduction that I worked on with a number of students and colleagues on the project. I hope that the book convinces other scholars and the panelists today to think about Canada's internment on new terms in different ways. I hope that this perspective centering on the dispossession changes how we think about that policy and those experiences. I hope that it also offers bridges between the internment and other facets of Canadian history. I think the centrality of the administrative state and of people responding to the ongoing activity of the administrative state suggests connections to other facets of Canadian history and the large projects of the Canadian state in the post-war period, perhaps in particular. And finally, I hope that this articulation of the internment era links it with a larger transnational scholarship on displaced people and the loss of home. But we'll really find out what significance the book may or may not have from the other panelists, so I look forward to their comments.
Great, thank you so much, Jordan. And so it's my pleasure to now introduce Constance Backhouse, who is a Fellow of the Royal Society, member of the Order of Canada, to which she was named in 2008. Constance Backhouse is a member of the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. She's published a whole number of prize-winning books, which I'm sure are familiar to many of the people in the audience today. Petticoats and Prejudice, Women in the Law in 19th Century Canada, Challenging Times, the Women's Movement in Canada and the United States. Are extremely influential, color-coded, A Legal History of Racism in Canada from 1900 to 1950. The Heiress versus the Establishment, Mrs. Campbell's Campaign for Legal Justice, Carnal Crime, Sexual Assault in Canada, 1900 to 1975. Her latest books, Claire Lheureux-Dubé, A Life, and two firsts, Bertha Wilson and Claire Lheureux-Dubé at the Supreme Court of Canada, were released in 2017 and 2019, respectively. Please join me in welcoming Professor Backhouse.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be asked to sit on the panel, and I applaud the editor and the many authors who researched and wrote and put together a remarkable volume of essays. It certainly did change my perception of internment. It moved my knowledge, you know, as somebody who had no personal familial experience with this, was largely limited to the harms of internment. And this was an amazing shift into a focus on property and dispossession. And I would not have guessed how full a picture one could produce amongst these essays. I really applaud the unprecedented depth and range of layers of research on the dispossession. And I think it's a very innovative framework to shift to property. I also was struck by, this is one really egregious example in Canadian history of displacement, but there are so many Indigenous displacements, displacements of Métis communities, African Canadian communities, working class communities. We have waves of dispossession and displacement. And it would be very interesting to think in future about how to connect those. Where are the parallels? Where are the distinctions? What happens when it's based on race, when it's based on class? I think it's an interesting new question that your book helps very much to raise for me. So I have just a couple of points that I'd like to speak to in my short remarks. And the first, not surprisingly, because I'm white, has to do with white people. I was fascinated by how the property focus allows us a lens into the white neighbors. And I was struck by the looting and the vandalism where the police stood by, and by the enthusiastic participation in 250 public auctions. And as I read through that, I thought to myself, my gosh, it's like shades of white euphoria around racialized lynching. We've all seen the references to the crowds that gathered and celebrated lynching. There was that same sense of white people foaming at the mouth over the chance to publicly display the racism against the Japanese Canadian community. And of course, the offshoot of that, also connected to property, was the profiteering. And the book really demonstrates that this is not small-scale pilfering, but a major economic shift of assets. And in particular, the story about H.R. McMillan, who managed to parlay the theft of the Japanese community into the largest lumbering company, one of the largest lumbering companies in the world. And when one thinks about reparation, it's on a par with reparation for slavery in terms of the kind of wealth that was extracted in that profiteering by whites. I have another point, which was one that you've mentioned already, the role of the bureaucracy and the failure of law. 8 years of sustained government work to fully complete the dispossession and the theft of the property. And I'm no stranger to the failure of law on gender and race, on class. It's a terrible history that we have here. But from elected politicians to lawyers to judges, there is such pandering to racist sentiments and courtrooms that sat watching and participating in travesties of injustice. It just fits with a very humiliating, appalling history of Canadian law aiding and abetting racism. Two remaining points. One is the continuing effects, which is well documented, the theft of the property and the displacement. So there was no home to go back to, a deliberate effort either to send the Japanese away from Canada or to scatter them in small communities throughout the country, and not even in neighborhoods where they could congregate and recreate community. And I was struck, I have actually friends who talk about their second generation after the internment, but they talk about how their families were afraid to settle in a neighborhood that had other Japanese on the block or the next block over, for fear that that would be viewed as a threat. And to think about the kind of severing and obliterating of a racially focused community is really scary in terms of the way, I mean, some of our laws used to say you can't have a political rally. You can't hire lawyers, right? We had laws that did that kind of thing to socialists, to indigenous people, but I don't really think we've got a parallel here in terms of the scattering. Lastly, I just wanted to raise the symbolism of naming places and buildings and public monuments. I was struck by the chapter about Port Alberni Member of Parliament Alan Neil, who is honored by the naming of Neil Street and the A.W. Neil School in Port Alberni, despite his history of racism against people of Asian descent and First Nations, and the effort to remove his name from the public honorifics, and the failure of that effort. And of course, that's one of mushrooming that we're seeing across all of our country and the United States, controversies over US Confederacy statutes, Sir John A. Macdonald, the famous 5 statues, and my own experience is with Canada's first woman lawyer, Clara Brett Martin, who was someone that we dredged from the tomb of historical archives when we discovered her, and told the story about her career and her life, only to find that she was anti-Semitic. And we had just only completed naming buildings after her and scholarships and having portraits painted and hung in various prominent places. And the big question then was, what do we do with all of that? And her name was stripped from everything. And so one of the questions in my mind, and I'd love to know what you think, is what do we do about this? Do we strip the names? Do we topple the statues? Or as historians, do we take a different perspective on that? And I don't really have an answer, except I'm fascinated by what's unrolling before our very eyes. So that's it.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll move on to our second speaker, Maryka Omatsu, became the first woman of East Asian descent to be appointed judge in Canada 27 years ago. In the 1980s, Judge Omatsu acted as legal counsel for the National Association of Japanese Canadians and was a member of their strategy and negotiation team that won redress for her community. Today, she is a member of the organization's team seeking redress from the province of British Columbia. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be on this panel, and I thank Jordan for editing this collection. The Japanese Canadian community owes a large debt to Jordan Stanger-Ross and the Landscapes of Injustice Collective for uncovering new facts about the role that the legal system, politicians, and widespread anti-Japanese Canadian racism played in the ethnic cleansing, incarceration, dispossession, and destruction of my community. BC has been a deeply racist province since its inception. There were, for example, 175 anti-Asian laws from 1895 to 1950. These impacted the daily lives of all Asian Canadians in the province, depriving them of their citizenship rights, the ability to work, and to live where they wanted. The war gave the province the opportunity to rid BC and then Canada of all Japanese Canadians. The book lays bare the thinking behind the dispossession of the community, which was that if Canadians had nothing to return to, then it would be easier to exile and deport them to Japan. For almost a century, British Columbians supported these policies, laws, and actions and benefited from them. In an earlier paper, Jordan wrote entitled Suspect Properties, laid out the city of Vancouver's role in the acquisition of Japanese Canadian property. This plan, which resulted in the eventual taking of all property, personal and real, of the 22,000 Japanese Canadians, was the impetus of the community's recent talks with municipal politicians and officials on redressing the city's role in our dispossession, which is the second largest in the history of Canada. The further disclosure by the Landscapes of Injustice researchers on the role played by BC politicians in the ethnic cleansing of the province is one of the bases for our demands for redress from BC. The disturbing revelations of the deep-seated racism among the general BC population, dating as far back as the initial settling of the province, is important if current-day discussions of racism can result in any change. The COVID pandemic uncovered the deep roots of anti-Asian racism, such that today, 30% of Chinese Canadians and 27% of Korean Canadians have reported incidents of racism. Post the killing of George Floyd, Canadians are discussing systemic racism against Indigenous, Black, and persons of color. Japanese Canadian history is a stark reminder of the harm done by racism to individuals and communities. In my view, the book's findings call out for at least 3 areas of further study. 1, a closer examination of the profiteers. Constance already mentioned H.R. Macmillan, but another one would be Gavin Mowat, who was an agent for the custodian of enemy property on Salt Spring Island. He bought the 600-acre property of Mr. Iwasaki for $5,250. Subsequently, in 17 years of subdivision and sales, the Mowats netted more than $1.2 million by just selling 73 of the 600 acres that they had initially purchased. The second area is for further disclosure of the role of the BC newspapers in fanning the flames. And thirdly, an investigation of the support by British Columbians for a whites-only province. After the Japanese Canadian community was removed from the coast, almost every property owned by them was broken into, looted, and vandalized. I was horrified that the ashes from the Buddhist temple in Steveston were scattered over the floor, seats, and shrine. And as Constance mentioned, there were 250 public auctions held at the time, and thousands of British Columbians attended these popular events, purchasing 90,000 personal items that had belonged to their former neighbors, who of course received nothing. Landscapes of Injustice contains a treasure trove of information that I hope will spur more research and inquiry. Hopefully, the essays contained in the book will provide teachers and students with information that tell the Japanese-Canadian story and keep that history alive. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll now introduce our third and final panelist, who is responding to Jordan's initial comments as well as to the broader book. And that is Nick Mulder, who is an assistant professor at Cornell University and who works on European and international history from 1870 to the present. His research focuses on political and economic history, internationalism, and the history of war. His current book project, The Economic Weapon, provides a history of the interwar origins of economic sanctions. So over to you.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. My thanks especially to Jordan Stanger-Ross, as well as to Michael Abe for the logistics, and to Caitlin Findlay, who's one of the researchers on this project who first brought the Landscapes of Injustice project to my attention. I'm going to give a few short comments that are really not so much criticism, because I have nothing but admiration really for the effort and comprehensiveness of the research done in this book, but really more invitations to say a little bit more about certain aspects of it, and to think also how we might apply some of the lessons of this history more broadly, because I think actually that the history of Japanese-Canadian dispossession has a lot of insights that can be brought to bear on the current situations and how we deal with these sorts of difficult legacies. Landscapes of Injustice is a very impressive research collective. Let me first of all say that. I really don't know anything quite like it from the history also of European expropriations, where there's been a lot of research into cases such as the dispossession of Jews in the 1930s and 40s across Europe. And it manages to combine, and I think this is a great strength of it, a real attention to administrative history, but also takes a social and local perspective. And it's particularly attentive because of its focus on property to the specific locations where Japanese Canadians held property and built their lives. So parts of the book really are urban history about particular city blocks in Vancouver and other places. Others are histories of specific patches of land that Japanese Canadians built their own sustenance and livelihood around. And then in terms of method also, the amount of oral historical research from survivors and descendants of Japanese Canadians who were interned is really impressive. And altogether, I think that mixing that and then putting it into the service of public history is really kind of unique combination that I haven't seen before, and which deserves great praise. At a more historical level, I also think that one of the innovations of the book is to break open the process of dispossession and expropriation, which is all too often portrayed as something that is done by a kind of unitary state, possessed of a single will against specific communities or minorities, but also against specific categories of person based on race or class or gender. In fact, what Landscapes of Injustice shows is that the state apparatus of Canada in the 1940s was quite complex, and also that there were a lot of local interest groups who pushed forward and took things into their own hands, and as a result contributed and accelerated a process of dispossession. And this provides us with a much more nuanced view, I think, of this history, which is really important. But also fundamentally, it actually does work, which a lot of history sometimes misses, which is that it explains why this process happened. It actually provides us with an insight into how people working and oftentimes seizing opportunities end up contributing to such grave injustices and harms. So my really two remaining comments are about the wider international and legal history that we might see Japanese Canadian dispossession in, and then something I think also about the present. First of all, the expropriation mechanism that was used, the custodian of enemy property, was an office created under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And even though in the 1940s, This was the first time that it was applied on a large scale. In Canada, the Trading with the Enemy Act had a longer history in the British Empire. It was first passed by the Parliament of the UK in 1914 in World War I, and it was then oftentimes either directly adopted or adopted by the local legislatures in British colonies and British dominions. And as a result, we see a common pattern of expropriation across these different regions. And the custodian model became extremely popular among both the American government, which adopted its own version of the Trading with the Enemy Act, where it was known as alien property, but also in other British colonies. And in the 1940s, this had wider ramifications across the British imperial space. And at the same time that the Japanese-Canadian internment and dispossession took place, in other parts of the British imperial territories that were transitioning into the British Commonwealth by 1949, there were processes taking place, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, between the partition of India and Pakistan, and in Palestine and during the creation of the State of Israel. And the Trading with the Enemy Act and this office of a custodian that managed dispossessed property was common to all of it. So in that sense, I also really think that the Landscapes of Injustice project brings out and properly fits the history of Japanese-Canadian dispossession and internment in a much wider and important global history of the 1940s, which is of course a moment that's produced much of our human rights understanding of the present. And thanks to this collection, I think it's now really possible to fit a large new component into all of this work. And finally, of course, first and foremost, the book and the collection is driven by a really impassioned sense of urgency about the restitution and the justice that can be done to the Japanese-Canadian community today. And that's really, first and foremost, I think, one of its virtues. But I also think that in this day and age, when we are witnessing new processes, and of course, racism has not disappeared, but we're also seeing a new set of concerns being peddled, justified by the logic of national security, that focuses particularly on Asian communities, not just in North America, but across the West. And that particularly now is focused, I guess, on the Chinese community in various places. And as a historian of economic sanctions, in this particular moment, it's really noticeable when you look, for example, at the Western attempt to now put more pressure on Huawei and companies of that nature. It's clearly not yet anywhere near the scale of these events of the 1940s, but it's starting to have effects on travel restrictions, on economic liberties, on people's ability to be considered fully equal. And in that sense, I think that this really has moral lessons that speak to the present in multiple ways, far beyond the immediate location of British Columbia. And so in that sense, it's a very, very useful project. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. So let's turn it over then to Jordan to see if he has a kind of response to any of the responses.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and thank you all to all the panelists for such generous comments and reflections on the book. There are a number of issues raised, but I guess, in fact, my impulse, if this person on the line will agree to this, is a number of you, or at least certainly Constance and Maryka, talked about that looting and the auctions. And I've been asked sometimes what the most surprising facet of the research was, and maybe because I wasn't the person who unearthed that evidence, that has been one of the most surprising. And I think it really does change how we look at the era to understand the scale of local looting and theft. And so one of my favorite historians is on the call here, Caitlin Finley, who was research coordinator on the project, and she has her video up, so she's especially easy target. But Caitlin, I wonder whether you want to talk about that facet of the research, which I think really is one of the major contributions of the work.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for all the comments so far. It's really, like Jordan said, wonderful to hear people engage and see the different directions that the work can be taken. I was also shocked and kind of like horrified to come across those records, and I'm on the spot a bit, but I guess I've had maybe I can say two things in that regard. One, it's the case that they were really buried in the archive. And I think maybe this is like a methodological lesson, but it required having the time to go, like for me to just sort of trawl through the state records to find that material. And I think part of this history is that it really, when you think of the first historians like Kenadachi and Tsunehara, those are people who were working on community funds. And so we're looking to tell kind of the backbone of the story. And this, they mentioned that there was looting, but to find these kind of more like heinous incidences of violence, that required just a lot of time looking through the records. And I think that's one value of having such a big project as Landscapes of Injustice. And my second comment is, I think that with the digitization of all these records, and as families are going to be able to find their own personal case files, much more, the breadth of such instances will become more clear. And I think that, like Constance says, really points, like turns our heads towards the neighbor and sort of expands responsibility from politicians and policymakers to also people on the ground. So I think it does change how we see the dispossession.
Thanks, Caitlin. And I did definitely put you on the spot, so well done. I wonder if we should open, Sean, because I'm conscious we don't have that much time remaining. I wonder if we should open to other questions. Maybe we can circle back also to some of the questions of the panel, or themes.
Sure, absolutely. If anyone would like to ask a question, please just sort of indicate it in the chat, and then I'll call on you.
Maybe while we wait for that, and people go ahead and put, here comes one. All right, let's go ahead. Let's go to that one.
Okay, and so if we can hear from Angela, please.
Hi everyone. Thanks. I'll be quick. I'm not a historian, so I'll start by saying that. And so my question is not really a historical one, but it's one that I think about a lot. And one that's sort of like, you know how people say, oh, we can learn from history, like people have said that today. And I think that's really true. I think that one of the things that history does is it reveals how local situations are like so deeply complex. So when you're wanting to do that learning from history, it requires as much context as historians have to execute in their work in sort of like organizing in the present. So in terms of, I'm thinking about the Powell Street area in the downtown east side and legacies of displacement in that neighborhood. And I know there's like a sort of like partner's the wrong word, but like a adjacent research project called The Right to Remain. And like, I just feel like there's a lot of synergies there. I've worked on The Right to Remain. So I'm wondering from the LOI perspective and from those historical grounds, when you think about those like legacies of displacement, which I know is kind of like a presentist take, but I think we can all agree that it matters, right? And so I'm just wondering from like a historical perspective, how you see LOI as a project and also this book as sort of like supporting or catalyzing that organizing and working even like across class, because Japanese Canadians were not just racialized, they were also poor. So for the most part anyway. So yeah, that's my question. What do we, when we say we want to learn from history, what does that actually mean for sort of the local context, if not elsewhere in BC, then in the Palestry area?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Those are great questions, and you've been working with a great project there in Right to Remain, which is now working in a new phase with SRO, a single residency. So
Yeah.
I'm not on that project, but
single room occupancy hotels, yeah.
Yeah, hotels, and doing really important work with people facing displacement and dispossession today. So really wonderful project or set of projects. I think, you know, our project in working always with the Japanese Canadian community tended to answer this question in multiple ways. One, I think, facet of doing this kind of history is that is for those folks who are thinking specifically about that history or who have lived with it in their families, and not only Japanese Canadians, but also certainly other British Columbians, other Canadians. So it's my sense that as a society that has a history of injustice, as perhaps all societies do have histories of injustice, that we live with those histories. The families that were dispossessed live with that dispossession, but also you only have to get on a call-in radio show or post an op-ed in a newspaper in BC and see the comments thread to see that lots of other British Columbians are also living with this history as well, and are angry about it and have interpretations of it. And so I think it's there isn't an opportunity of not living with that history. So it's my commitment as an historian to try and engage those past in ways that I think contribute to a justice-seeking society that offers honesty to people who suffered the dispossession. And so there's some present work having to do with that specific past that I think is necessary today. And I don't think if historians step back from that work, those histories will somehow disappear in their present manifestations. And then there's a question more broadly, Angela, that you were asking, and that I think a lot of folks working in this area want to ask: what broader democratic work can a project like this do? There's a chapter in the book that tries to deal with that most directly, right at the end of the book, that talks about forms of political accountability that can emerge from engagement with this history of inculcating, both among policymakers and a wider society, a sense of accountability, a holding to account of people who have been involved in justice, that my colleague, a political scientist, Matt James, thinks might help to shape the culture of governance as well as the culture of citizenship. So we live in a society that anticipates that we will hold to account perpetrators of past harms, that can have an impact on the democratic culture we inhabit. My colleague in law, Eric Adams, with whom I wrote about the legal challenge to the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. Eric also writes frequently in newspapers and so on, and I think often makes the claim that constitutional structures in and of themselves don't safeguard a just society, but rather it's a constitutional culture, or the uses to which we put our institutions. And certainly the dispossession of Japanese Canadians offers evidence of the ways in which notions of justice and fair play and so on and citizenship could be in fact marshaled in service of injustice. So again, studying that process might inculcate a kind of culture, constitutional culture in which we recognize that we have to use our institutions that are organized around justice in ways that actually seek justice. I guess the final thing, where I come from on this is viewing the field of, say, a kind of justice-seeking democratic society as diverse, as involving projects like Right to Remain that are actively engaging residents who are being dispossessed of their homes. And I think in that context, history plays a role, that we're all better off in a society, more likely to undertake those current initiatives if we're living in a society that's engaging those past injustices, than allowing ourselves to live in a society, for example, where the only purveyor of history is the state, for example, right? That most of us would not want to inhabit most of the societies that have allowed that to occur. So in that way, history plays a role. Sometimes I think of it as a kind of a rearguard role, while folks like you are down at the SROs working with people being dispossessed today.
Thanks, Jordan. We have a question from Maryka, who I think would like to offer a response to Constance.
Constance, you mentioned the sort of denaming of buildings because of the wrongdoings of the famous person. And I note that Professor Mills, you teach at U of T, and I was an undergrad and a graduate student at U of T. And of course, one of the main buildings on St. George in the downtown campus is Sidney Smith. And I was distressed to learn from the book that he had been the judge in Vancouver who approved each and every sale of the custodian. And just recently, I was approached about the naming of, I believe it's a hospital, after Mr. Pearson, who is famous as a famous racist, and whether or not the Japanese Canadian community would have a position on whether or not a hospital should be named after this man. So I've thought about Sidney Smith, and I'd be interested, Constance, what you think about these things.
I don't know what to say. I struggle with this a lot. Some of you may know a now retired law professor from Carleton University, Diana Majuri, who is insistent that we should not name anything after individual people. That to the extent that great things are done in this world, they're always on the backs of large numbers of people. It's never one person, and one person is never perfect. So if we scratch the surface of every one of us, we're going to find a lot of things that we're not happy about. And so that's her view. That said, I have spent my historical career looking for individuals who were overlooked, who railed against injustice, usually unsuccessfully, but trying to bring them back into focus and tell their stories to give comfort and hope and inspiration to all of us who are trying and mostly failing to fix things now. So I'm in a real quandary about that. As a historian, I'd love to see two buildings side by side with big plaques explaining why one name is here and another name is there and how they fit together historically. That never seems to satisfy people when I suggest that. So I guess politically speaking, whenever a community or an activist group has come and said, this name must go, I have always stood with them and said, yes, okay. But it kind of hurts me a bit that some of the historical actors who have mixed records are going to go down into dust and we'll never know who they were.
Thank you. I have a question that follows up on that, a question for Jordan. I followed your career with great interest for some time, and the Landscape of Injustice project really, in many ways, speaks to issues that you have been concerned with in your earlier points of your career, but it also is a departure. And it's a departure in particular in terms of the way in which research was conducted, the way in which research is disseminated. And I think you spoke really eloquently about the importance of collaborative research, and this is sort of speaking to the question of what is important, an individual or a large group of people. And we know obviously the great advantages of the Landscape of Injustice project in collaborative research. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, maybe self-critically, about what some of the limitations are, what some of the challenges are, to kind of help us understand this real kind of pivot in terms of how you've gone about the very process of researching and writing and disseminating knowledge.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess, I mean, for me, it's been a really, I was struggling, maybe many academics do, after finishing my first book, which was on Italian communities in Toronto and Philadelphia, and I was kind of spinning my wheels for a while. And I remember very clear, trying to figure out what the next work I wanted to do. And I remember very clearly being in Library and Archives Canada and seeing really just a tiny bit of the records that related to this history. And I had been teaching the history of migration in Canada enough to know that much of that material really hadn't been brought into the historical record. And I was just amazed, and I had this kind of rush of a feeling, oh, this is the thing, this is the thing. And then the conversations I had within the community really kind of shifted that from an individual research project into something that was really engaged with people. And people are complex creatures, and I had never done this kind of work before. And there are people on the call who know that it took a while to build trust, and it was an adventure, but it was so incredibly positive for me, and I feel so satisfied by the work at this stage that it's hard for me to see real drawbacks from my perspective to this model of research. I will say, but one thing I've maybe a kind of older and in some senses less specific to this form of research challenge that I think, or dynamic that I would say I've noticed. So I'm not Japanese Canadian, and I have been leading this project. Simultaneously, I've been working on Holocaust memorialization in Victoria, in a very small personal project of mine. In that project, I'm both a quite active member of the community whose history I'm analyzing, and I'm also not in a large community engaged project. I'm just kind of doing my own thing. And I would say that there are forms of criticism that I am comfortable making in that context that are not available within this kind of a setting. So I think my own critiques of the ways in which the Jewish community is memorializing the Holocaust, there have been scholars within our project who have wanted to see analyses, somewhat analogous analyses of Japanese Canadian approaches to Japanese Canadian history, that either because the project was community engaged or because of who I am and the particular dynamics, that mode of critique is not was not something that I think our project could easily accomplish. So that's a kind of a limit. There was nothing to prevent any individual scholar from undertaking that kind of critique, but within the larger direction of the project. So there's a certain freedom. I did experience a certain gleeful, reckless abandon as I started, undertaking to critique my own community in a solo project that is not available as project director of a partnership grant project.
Thank you. Are there others who would like to ask questions either to Jordan or to other members of our panel? I will mention that we have advertised it's going to be a 1-hour event, and so it's we've hit the 1-hour mark. Panelists and Jordan have said they're willing to stick around if there are questions, but if you need to quietly slip away, then that is fine. Any other questions or thoughts or comments? I think Maryka, yeah.
I had a question for Jordan. 1,700 properties were sold by the custodian without their owner's consent. And we know that BC politicians, federal, provincial, and municipal politicians led this successful campaign. And in our present day talks with the City of Vancouver and the province, it would be helpful to know what properties these governments acquired then and still own today. Do you happen to, in your research, did you happen to come across that kind of information?
I don't have a straightforward, Maryka and I, in fact, we've had some exchanges along this line before. So there are some properties that are presently held by the province, including a courthouse in the downtown east side, that the value of which is hard to indicate precisely because of it being a courthouse. But it's a very valuable and large kind of full city block almost, I think, property. And so that's an example of a large and valuable piece of property that passed, that was owned by Japanese Canadians, was then as the city of Vancouver was undertaking sort of clearances and rebuilding in the post-war period, was acquired by the city and then sold at a significant profit to the province for that court building. So that's an example of a property where I think there's a history of benefit on the part of the municipal government from those dispossessed properties, and there's a history, and there's an extremely valuable asset that is held by the province. It didn't go directly into state ownership during the dispossession period. There was an intervening period of other private ownership. We haven't found, I don't think, in our research collective, clear examples of the kind of very straightforward graft of a kind of grab by the government that, for instance, Nick talks about in other contexts where public bodies directly profited from the acquisition of property through custodians of enemy property. Nick, you correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's been one of your findings internationally.
Yeah, that's right. So it was interesting also to read about your findings about fair market value, which played a very important role, and also in the Bird Commission's findings, right, about whether these properties were purposely undervalued when they were sold off to minimize the gains that the dispossessed Japanese Canadians could obtain from them. In other places, such as in the US, for example, in World War I already, German and Austro-Hungarian citizens or people who had a dubious status and could be labeled by the American government as such, very often lost everything, and it was actually fully liquidated. And there, the fair market value provision, in fact, served to maximize revenue for the state. So that I think is more, confiscation is a better way of talking about it, because it's about the fiscal benefits. But that really shows how important it is to study these expropriation machines in their local context, I think. Yeah.
So we found, as the chapter on land title develops, the notion of properties sold below value at the time or even instances of government acquisition. I mean, Moet is an example on Salt Spring Island, who was mentioned by, was it Maryka who mentioned, yeah, him. So he's working in the custodian's office and is able to make that kind of an acquisition. So we do have instances like that. I think you know, as I argue in that chapter from Land Title, I think that that most of the unjust loss is instead as a result of being divested from the market, and that if in a search for kind of direct graft or even sales below market value, we overlook a much larger economic harm of being divested from the market, forced to use the equity to support themselves, and banned from reinvesting in real estate, such that, you know, those owners who were on the verge of multi-generational transformative asset holding, as we all know what happened in the lower mainland, so, and elsewhere in coastal BC, people who had managed, immigrants and their children who had managed to acquire and make viable 30 acres of land in the lower mainland, were sitting on the eve of incredible benefit, and instead other people received that benefit. So if their land was sold for somewhat less than market value, as it often was, that matters, certainly. But even more dramatic is the wealth that they missed out on over the next 30, 40 years, and that other people didn't miss out on because they owned those farms, right? So, so that's been more the direction that our analysis has. But there are some. I mean, there are some instances like that. The courthouse in the Powell Street neighborhood that I think would fit the description.
Thanks, Jordan. We'll make a kind of last call to see if anyone has a final question that they would like to ask, either to Jordan or to the panelists. If no one is coming forward, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, as well as Jordan, for pulling together this really fascinating book and this great discussion. So thank you, everybody, for being here, as well as to our panelists and our speaker.
Thank you, Sean and Max and panelists. Yeah, and thank you to the audience.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.